Thank you, John. The presentation I'm going to give today is based on a report which we commissioned along with DEFRA to look, as John has already said, at wheat and oilseed rape yields in the UK, look at the issue of plateau and what we can do to overcome that. It's a large report, it goes to about 70,000 words, and I can only touch on a few main points today. There is a 20-page summary, so I'd suggest you go to our website and look at the summary, then perhaps dip into the main part of the report in the areas you're interested in. Okay, we have a problem in the UK. After World War II, national wheat yields were around 2.5 to 3 tonnes per hectare, and they climbed fairly steadily up until the mid-1990s. After that period, we've seen almost no increase in national wheat yields. And of course, this year, 2012, there's been nothing short of a disaster. Now, 10 years ago, no one really cared about this because wheat was £60 a tonne. Farmers are trying to cut back on costs. The politicians didn't care because the world appeared to be awash with food. Now, with wheat £200 a tonne and the world apparently in an almost perpetual food crisis, everyone wants to increase yields, but it's not entirely clear what's constraining yields and why we haven't managed to do that over the last few years. The situation with oilseed rape is slightly different. It only became a major crop in the UK in the late 1970s, and we only really have good data from the early 1980s. But from the early 1980s onwards, what we saw was actually quite a dramatic decline in oilseed rape yields, followed by a period of instability. And it's really only in the last few years where we've seen oilseed rape yields start to increase. But we're still only at the levels that we were back in the 1980s, and I think we can do better than that. There are, of course, a number of factors which impact on yields on farm. Genetic yield potential is one, what the breeders are delivering. Weather and climate. We've seen this year the devastating effects that weather can have on yields. But what we asked the people who wrote this report to focus on was agronomy. That's what we can change. There are a number of aspects to agronomy which we asked them to look at. Prices and policy. We have fewer, larger farms than we did 20 or 30 years ago. We have less labour on farms, and we're subject to more regulation. There's been technical change in tillage in particular. We've seen changes in fertiliser rates and large changes in crop protection. And there's been emerging threats to yield, new pests and diseases, emergence of resistance to fungicides and pesticides. We've lost a lot of pesticides due to regulation change. I'm going to go through each crop in turn and just pick out some of the main points from the report. And if you ask the French, they have a similar problem to us. They would say that 2/3 of their lost yield is due to climate change. And they've particularly picked up on days above 25 degrees centigrade during grain fill. We know that has a physiological effect on yield and knocks yield back. But in the UK, there doesn't seem to be any trend in these number of days above 25 degrees centigrade. This is data from eastern England. As you can see, there's no real trend from 1980 onwards. It doesn't necessarily mean that climate change is off the hook. We think that since 1980, the increase in mean temperature during grain fill has probably reduced grain fill period by about 6%. However, that's probably been compensated for by the increase in carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere, which we know encourages plant growth. That doesn't, however, mean that climate is totally off the hook in the UK. This table shows wheat yield trends in recommended list trials over the last 9 years. And the data has been divided in a number of different ways. First of all, if we divide the data on a regional basis, we can see in the dry eastern parts, there's been almost no annual increase in yield in the recommended list trials. If we go to the west, where it's a bit wetter, there's a small increase. If we go to the north, where it's wet and cool, there's been a fairly strong increase in recommended list trial yields over the last 9 years. If we divide the data in another way, by soil texture, we can see on the heavy textured soils, again, quite a strong increase, but on the light textured soils, almost no increase in recommended list trial yields. If we divide it again, but this time into early sown and late sown trials, and the early sown trials, again, a fairly strong growth, but in the late sown trials, actually a reduction in yields in recommended list trials over the last 10 years. What connects all these? Well, we think it's spring and early summer drought. Spring and early summer drought obviously has more of a negative impact in the east because it's dry already, has more of an impact on light textured soils. and it has more of an impact on late sown crops because more of their growing period is in those early spring and summer droughts. Whether that's due to climate change or whether that's just due to weather, I'll let you decide. Tillage is another aspect that we think is probably important. The next few graphs I'm going to show will have a grey line on, and that's national wheat yield. The other two lines on this graph are the percentage of the wheat area established by conventional ploughing, the green line, and the purple line is established under reduced till. What we can see back from 1980 at the start of the graph, around 60% of the wheat area is established by plough. This increased to around 90% by the mid-1990s and then declined again to its current level of about 60%. Now the Danes have looked a lot at their wheat plateau. They have a similar problem to us, and they think that min-till is a big problem in their country because of surface compaction. We're not quite so sure, but we do know from experimental work that in the period when we change from a plough-based system to a min-till system, there is a yield cost. What we don't know is how long that yield cost lasts and how long, and whether in a rotational ploughing system you still get that cost. But we think there's probably a negative impact from the min-till that we're using now. Moving on to nutrition, this is quite an interesting graph. Again, yield in the grey, and the red line is total nitrogen applied to wheat crops. As you can see, since 1980, it basically hasn't changed at all. Now this we can present as a positive factor. This is sustainable intensification. We're producing more wheat from the same amount of fertiliser. But we do think now that modern elite wheat varieties probably need around 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per extra tonne of yield. We're now almost certainly starving some of our wheat crops of nitrogen, and we need to think about nitrogen rates again. Moving on now to sulphur, the graph on the left shows, and the green line is sulphur emissions in the UK, and the bars at the bottom are sulphur deposition. The graph on the right shows the percentage area of wheat which receives sulphur fertiliser in the blue line, and the red line shows the average application rate. And we know that in about 2004, already 60% of wheat crops were at high or medium risk of sulphur deficiency. And yet, since 2004, the amount of sulphur being deposited has declined, but we're still only treating around 40% of our crops with sulphur. There are crops out there that are not achieving their yield potential because they're not getting enough sulphur, and we need to look at sulphur applications. Pest and disease, this is a fairly easy one. There's no evidence that was found in the report for a trend in disease rates and no evidence for a trend in pest rates. Just a couple of examples. The top one shows septoria, again, yield in the grey, and the green line shows septoria. There was a bit of an anomaly in the early 2000s when the strobilurin stopped working, but no real trend. In the case of rust, brown and yellow, if anything, there's been a declining trend in brown and yellow rust in wheat. So nothing to account for the yield plateau, nothing to stop us increasing yields. Moving on now to management. This is quite an interesting graph. This data comes from the Farm Business Survey, which looks at about 800 farms annually. And this is data, the farms have been divided into yield quartiles. So the purple line at the top is the top 25% of farms in terms of their yield of wheat. And we've got the middle two quartiles and the bottom 25% in terms of their wheat yield. And if we go back to 1987, when this graph starts, the difference in the bottom and the top yielding farms was about 3 tonnes per hectare. But as we move along, the gap gets bigger. The top 25% of farms have barely registered a yield plateau, but the bottom 25%, they started to plateau much earlier, and if anything, their yields are starting to decline now. What's causing this? Well, obviously these farms are probably on less good soils, they're probably mixed farms with a small area of wheat. But we know from the Farm Business Survey, those top 25% of farms are spending more on labour, they're spending more on machinery, they're spending more on pesticides and fertilisers, and they're achieving higher gross margins. So it looks from the Farm Business Survey data that where investment is made in growing wheat, there's no need for a yield plateau. Now obviously farmers have to be incentivised to put that money into their wheat crops. When it's £60 a tonne, no one was putting any money into wheat. But we need to turn that around. And this data suggests we can turn it around, at least on some farms. So just to summarise the wheat, factors contributing to the wheat yield plateau. I didn't talk about genetic improvement or breeding, but all the evidence suggests that that's positive. The breeders are still doing as well as they ever did. Tillage, we think it's having a negative effect. We're not quite sure how small it is or how large it is, but we think it's definitely negative. Nitrogen nutrition, definitely negative, and in some cases could be quite substantial. Sulfur nutrition, negative. Climate and weather, I'll ignore that, negative. And there are lots of other factors, such as deep soil compaction, deteriorating drainage, poor seed rates, poor timeliness. All of these are likely to be having a negative impact, but we don't know how big they are because we haven't got enough data, or in some cases got no data to assess them properly. Just moving on quickly to oilseed rape. First looking at varieties. This is a very revealing graph. On the oilseed rape graphs, the blue line is yield. And in this case, the red line is the yield that would have been achieved in each of those years if instead of growing the actual varieties that were grown, farmers grew the top yielding variety on the recommended list. Now that's never going to happen because people pick varieties for all sorts of different reasons. But the interesting part is if we go back to the early 1990s, there was hardly any difference between the best varieties and what was actually being grown on farm. But during the 1990s, on-farm yield increased, but the potential yield that could have been gained continued to go up and up and up, and this gap grew to about half a tonne per hectare. In this period, farmers weren't choosing the best varieties. They were choosing varieties because they were cheaper, because there was no incentive to grow yield, and they were using home farm saved seed. Since the early 2000s, that gap has stopped increasing and started to narrow, if anything. So farmers are starting to pick up on the better varieties, but there's probably still more that could be done there. Rotations. This graph shows yield again in blue, but the green line is the percentage of crops of oilseed rape established after a 4-year break or larger, and the orange-yellow line shows crops established after a 2-year break. And what we know from experimental work is that if you grow oilseed rape 1 year in 2, you're going to look at something like a 12%, up to a 12% yield penalty. If you grow 1 year in 3, which is what's going on here, you're looking at up to a 6% yield penalty. We're growing more and more oilseed rape in the rotation, and there are probably farms out there now that are growing too much oilseed rape and are suffering significant yield penalties because of it. Nutrition. Nitrogen again, blue is the yield. Back in the early 1980s, we were putting 275 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen on oilseed rape. That declined quite steeply, down to its current level of around 200 kilograms per hectare. Now, the evidence that this level is now causing a reduction in yield is nowhere near as strong as it is for wheat. We think there is probably something that could be done with nitrogen rates on oilseed rape now. Moving on to sulfur, you've already seen this graph. And the graph on the left, again, is percentage of oilseed rape treated in the blue, and the red is the average field application rate. And again, from work that was done during the early 2000s, we think that by 2002, 60% of oilseed rape crops were at high risk of sulfur deficiency. And since then, deposition of sulfur has continued to decline, but we're still only putting sulfur on 60% of our oilseed rape crops, only just covering the ones that are at high risk. And HGCA, the new oilseed rape guide, suggests we should be putting sulfur on every single crop of oilseed rape. Disease, it's pretty similar to story to wheat. There's no real trends. Light leaf spot at the top, it goes up and down quite a lot, but there's no real trend over the period from the early 1980s. And foam at the bottom again, a lot of variation, but no real trend to account for yield changes. So just to summarise oilseed rape, again, a genetic improvement. The breeders seem to be doing a reasonably good job. They're delivering. Variety choice has certainly had quite a significant negative impact in the past. That negative impact is probably much less so now, but it's probably still having a slight negative impact on yields. Nitrogen and sulfur nutrition, again, both probably having a negative impact. Rotation is potentially quite a large negative impact now on some farms where we're growing far too much oilseed rape in rotation. And as with wheat, there's some other factors that we just don't have data. We can't really assess properly: turnip yellows, pigeons, weeds, etc. So just to summarise, a few of the key points that came out of the project report. of how we might overcome some of these agronomic constraints, more information to guide variety selection, and particularly in oilseed rape, but also in wheat. If we're going to get a lot more variability in weather, we need to provide more regional information. And the recommended list is moving in that direction now, providing more regional information on varieties. Obviously, there's cost implications in that. We need to get better use of our nitrogen. We probably can't add too much more because of environmental constraints, but with things we could do about nitrogen use efficiency. And we need to provide better information on sulphur. I don't think we need any more information to actually gather on sulphur, but we need to do better with KT, ensure that farmers are applying sulphur, certainly in the case of oilseed rape, pretty much to every crop. And light land, we could get rid of some of the problems of early spring and summer drought by sowing earlier. And we need to verify what the impacts of changing from plough to reduced till are. Is it a short-term negative impact or is it a long-term negative impact? Thank you very much.